I want to talk about a story that feels like a punch in the stomach. Two young American service members standing guard just blocks away from the White House, suddenly ambushed. One of them, 20-year-old specialist Sarah Beckstrom, is now gone. The other, Staff Sergeant Andrew Wolf, 24, is fighting for his life in a hospital bed. The suspected attacker? A 29-year-old man from Afghanistan who came to the United States as an asylum seeker after the fall of Kabul in 2021. So, what happened in Washington, D.C.? How did a man who once worked alongside U.S. forces end up accused of shooting them in the streets of the U.S. Capitol? And what does this say about immigration, about national security, about mental health, and about how we treat the people we bring here after war? Let's walk through what we know and what we don't know. And as always on this channel, I'll give you the context, you give your conclusions. On the afternoon before Thanksgiving, two National Guard soldiers from West Virginia were on patrol near the White House in Washington, D.C., as part of a federal mission to crack down on violent crime in the city. According to investigators, a man approached them and opened fire in what officials have called an ambush-style attack. Both soldiers were hit multiple times. At first, both of them were listed in critical condition. Then, the next day, President Trump announced that Specialist Sarah Beckstrom, only 20 years old, had died from her injuries. Staff Sergeant Andrew Wolf remains in critical condition, fighting for his life, as officials describe it. The suspect was wounded and taken into custody. Very quickly, authorities named him Rahmanullah Lakanwal, a 29-year-old Afghan national. So we have 3 lives shattered in one moment. A young woman dead, a young man in a hospital bed hanging on, and a suspect who may spend the rest of his life in prison, or worse. And the country is asking, why? Before we get into politics, vetting, and immigration, I want to pause on something important. These weren't just uniforms. Reports say Sarah Beckstrom was from a small town in West Virginia. She joined the National Guard in 2023, and she was part of the 863rd Military Police Company. Friends, family, and fellow soldiers describe her as dedicated, warm, and brave. Someone who volunteered for difficult shifts and believed in what she was doing. She was 20. Many of you watching this are around that age. Think about that for a second. Andrew Wolf, 24, is also a National Guard member, described as a committed service member with his whole future ahead of him. Right now, doctors are fighting to keep him alive. When we talk about policy, immigration, and security, it's easy to get lost in big words. But at the center of this are two very real people, with families, friends, dreams, and futures that were either taken or shattered in seconds. Now let's talk about the man accused of this attack. Authorities say the suspect is Rahmanullah Lakanwal, a 29-year-old Afghan national. He reportedly worked with U.S. forces during the war in Afghanistan, part of a special unit that cooperated closely with American intelligence. After the Taliban took over in 2021, he came to the United States through a program known as Operation Allies Welcome, which was designed to evacuate and resettle Afghans who had helped the U.S. military. He arrived in 2021 and was granted asylum earlier this year. According to reporting from the Associated Press and other outlets, people in his community in Washington state had noticed worrying changes in his behavior over the last few years. Long periods of isolation, quitting jobs, sudden road trips across the country, and signs of deep depression. One community advocate was so concerned they contacted refugee support organizations, fearing he might hurt himself. But what no one seemed to see coming was violence toward others. Investigators now believe he traveled across the country to Washington, D.C., and allegedly carried out this ambush on the 2 guardsmen close to the White House. Homeland Security officials have said they suspect he may have been radicalized after arriving in the U.S., possibly through online contacts or in his local community. But so far, they haven't publicly presented concrete evidence of that. So here we are with a brutal attack and more questions than answers. Was this driven by ideology? Was it a mental health crisis that exploded into violence? Was it a mix of trauma from war, isolation, and something darker online? Right now, we don't fully know. Legally, things are moving fast. The U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C. has upgraded the charges against Lakanwal to first-degree murder after Beckstrom's death, along with other serious charges related to the shooting of Wolf. The FBI has opened a terrorism investigation, trying to understand his motives, his communications, and whether anyone else was involved or encouraged him. At the same time, media reports say prosecutors may even seek the death penalty, depending on how the case develops and whether Staff Sergeant Wolf survives his injuries. But here's something crucial. Having suspicions is not the same thing as having proof. We've seen this in previous attacks. Early narratives can be incomplete, emotional, and sometimes flat out wrong. This shooting didn't just stay a crime story. It exploded straight into politics. In the days after the attack, President Trump and his administration announced a pause on all U.S. asylum decisions and a halt to issuing visas for people traveling on Afghan passports, directly linking these moves to this shooting in Washington, D.C. Officials also said they will re-review asylum and immigration cases from certain countries of concern and could strip status or deport people who no longer qualify. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem has publicly argued that this case shows failures in vetting and that the suspect could have been radicalized inside the U.S. after being brought here. On the other side, human rights organizations and the United Nations have raised alarms. They're warning that using one horrific attack to justify broad crackdowns on refugees and asylum seekers from entire regions could violate international commitments and punish thousands of innocent people who followed the rules, helped U.S. forces, and are simply trying to rebuild their lives. There's another layer that we can't ignore: mental health and trauma. Remember, this is someone who reportedly served in a CIA-backed Afghan unit who saw war up close and then was suddenly transplanted into a completely different life in the United States. According to reporting, people around him saw signs of serious psychological distress, isolation, depression, unstable behavior. A community advocate even tried to get him help, reaching out to organizations that work with refugees. Did the system fail him? Did we bring people here after the war and then leave them floating? Without enough mental health support? Without enough follow-up? Without enough integration into the community? To be clear, none of this excuses violence. Ever. But if we want to prevent the next tragedy, we can't just ask, who do we punish? We also have to ask, what did we miss? Stories like this are dangerous in another way too. They're emotional, they're shocking, and they can be used to push people into fear, division, and hatred. Some people will look at this and say, "See, this proves all refugees are dangerous." Others will say, "This is just propaganda to shut the door on people in need." But reality is usually more complicated. One Afghan man is accused of a terrible crime. Thousands of other Afghans who helped U.S. forces are living quietly, working, raising kids, and trying to heal from war. 2 American soldiers paid the highest price doing their job in their own capital. We can honor Sarah Beckstrom and fight for Andrew Wolf by refusing to forget the human beings behind this story, and by refusing to let this tragedy turn into easy slogans that ignore the deeper problems. So let me leave you with a few final questions to think about and to debate in the comments respectfully. What should justice look like in this case? Is a harsh individual punishment enough, or do we need systemic changes? Should this single attack reshape U.S. asylum and refugee policy for entire countries? Why or why not? What responsibility do governments have to provide long-term mental health care to people they bring in from war zones and to their own soldiers? This story is still developing. The investigation is ongoing, the politics are heating up, and somewhere, a family is planning a funeral while another family sits by a hospital bed. On this channel, I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm here to give you the pieces of the puzzle so you can decide how to put them together. If you want more coverage like this, deep dives that respect your intelligence and your emotions, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who you think needs to hear a more complete version of what's going on. Now, go to the comments and tell me, what part of this story disturbs you the most? The attack itself, the political reaction, or the signals that might have been missed before it happened? I'll be reading,